Ever assume type O is the boring blood type? No frills, no backstory? Just the safe universal donor sitting quietly on the shelf at every blood bank? Ancient genome research says otherwise. Your ancestors weren't merely surviving. They were locked in a genetic arms race against some of the deadliest diseases in human history. For decades, doctors treated O as the default. Nothing special, nothing to explain. But when scientists began combing through ancient DNA, they found something nobody had anticipated. Across parts of the Americas, indigenous communities don't just favor type O, they're almost entirely made up of it. Not 60%, not 80%. In some tribes, the figure tops 99%. That's not luck. That's not statistical noise built up over millennia. That's a message, etched directly into the bloodstream of an entire people. So what actually caused this? Why did a single blood type dominate an entire continent, while the rest of the world stayed thoroughly mixed? The explanation weaves together deadly outbreaks, ice age treks, ocean crossings once thought impossible, and a debate scientists still haven't resolved. And it begins with a puzzle nobody expected to find. Stay with this, because by the end, you'll see why type O may be the most consequential blood type in our species' story. Let's start with what's familiar. Human blood falls into four main categories: A, B, AB, and O. The distinction comes down to microscopic markers, antigens, sitting on the surface of red blood cells, essentially acting like ID tags. Type A carries the A tag. Type B carries the B tag. AB carries both. Type O carries none. Completely blank. That blankness is exactly why O earned its reputation as the universal donor. With no A or B antigen present, the immune system has nothing to attack, which means O blood can go into nearly anyone without triggering a dangerous reaction. When there's no time to run a blood test in an emergency room, O negative is the fallback, the safest option when every second counts. For most of the last century, that was the whole story. O is useful. O is widespread. O is simple. Except O was never supposed to be the default setting. Geneticists now believe type O arose from a mutation, a piece of genetic code that dropped out of the gene responsible for producing the A and B antigens. In other words, O isn't the original blueprint, it's the glitch, the accident. And yet that accident didn't just survive. In huge swaths of the world, it became dominant. Globally, type O is the single most common blood type, present in nearly half the world's population. That's already unusual for a trait that started as a deletion. But it gets far stranger. Look at certain indigenous communities across the Americas, and the number doesn't hover near half. It climbs to 90, then 95, and in some tribes nearly reaches 100. An entire population carrying, almost uniformly, a blood type that began life as a mistake. That's not background static in the genetic record. That's a signal. And once researchers started asking why one continent looks so different from everywhere else, they uncovered something most people have never heard of. To understand why, you have to zoom out and look at how blood types are distributed worldwide. In Africa, where human life is believed to have originated, type O appears at high frequency, which is part of why some scientists consider it one of the oldest variants still in wide circulation. As populations spread into Europe and Asia, the picture shifted. Type A grew more common across Western Europe. Type B rose sharply through Central and Eastern Asia. The clean four-letter system splintered unevenly across continents, shaped by thousands of years of migration, disease, and isolation. Then there's the Americas, and this is where the pattern breaks entirely. Instead of the blend seen in Europe or Asia, indigenous populations show overwhelming, near-uniform type O, with some communities reaching frequencies geneticists rarely see anywhere else on the planet. The leading explanation traces back to the last ice age, when small bands of early humans crossed a land bridge linking Siberia to Alaska. These founding groups were tiny, and many likely already carried type O blood. When a small population founds an entire lineage, whatever traits they happen to carry get amplified across generations until they define the whole group. That's part of the story, but there's a second factor. Once these early migrants settled into the Americas, the continent became cut off. Two oceans on either side meant almost no new genetic material arrived for thousands of years. No incoming blood types to dilute the pool. no outside populations mixing in to rebalance it. Type O simply had no competition. It became locked in, generation after generation, until it defined entire nations. Compare that to other isolated groups worldwide. Some Pacific Island populations show similarly skewed blood type frequencies for the exact same reason. Isolation locks in whatever genetic hand the founders were dealt. But nowhere does the pattern run as deep or as consistently as across the Americas. Numbers like that don't appear by chance, so scientists went looking for confirmation, and decades of research have backed it up repeatedly. Studies of Native American populations across many communities have found something almost hard to believe. In some groups tested, close to 99% carried type O blood. Not a strong majority. Nearly everyone, study after study, long before genome sequencing was even possible. And it wasn't confined to one region. Similar figures turned up everywhere researchers looked, from indigenous communities in the Canadian North down to groups deep in the Amazon rainforest. Different climates, different diets, different languages, entirely different environments, and the same blood type dominating again and again. So what was really going on? The leading explanation is natural selection doing exactly what it does over thousands of years. Early populations entering the Americas faced brutal conditions, harsh climates, unfamiliar pathogens, relentless physical demands just to survive long enough to reproduce. In circumstances like that, even a slight biological edge can snowball. If type O offered even a small advantage against the infections circulating at the time, carriers would have been more likely to survive, more likely to have children, and more likely to pass that same blood type forward. Repeat that across hundreds of generations, and a once random trait stops looking random. It starts looking inevitable. This is what most people miss when they hear that type O is common. Common doesn't mean ordinary. In the Americas, common means selected, chosen, generation after generation, by forces invisible to the people carrying it. Their bodies were quietly fighting battles they never knew about, and the survivors carried the proof forward in their blood. Modern DNA analysis has only reinforced what decades of blood typing first suggested. This wasn't drift, it wasn't coincidence, it was survival, written into the genome of an entire continent, one generation at a time. But the pressure wasn't uniform everywhere, which makes the story even more specific. Take the Andes, where some indigenous populations have lived at extreme altitude for millennia, breathing air with a fraction of the oxygen found at sea level. Their bodies adapted remarkably over generations, and researchers noticed something curious underneath those adaptations. A striking number of high-altitude indigenous communities carried type O blood. It's a contested idea, but here's the theory. Some researchers suggest type O blood may move somewhat more easily through narrow vessels, potentially assisting oxygen delivery to tissue, though this remains unproven and isn't broadly accepted in mainstream hematology. At sea level, any difference would barely register. At 12,000 feet, proponents argue it could matter more, a small, speculative biological tweak with a possible payoff in precisely the environment these populations settled. Then there's disease. Historical evidence suggests people carrying A or B antigens were hit harder by certain infections, because some pathogens are built to latch onto those exact molecular markers, like a key fitting a lock. Type O, lacking both, doesn't offer that same foothold. Malaria wasn't a major threat in pre-Columbian America, the way it was in Africa, but the broader principle still applies. Fewer molecular targets for pathogens means fewer avenues for disease to spread through a population. Diet adds another layer, though a much shakier one. Indigenous communities ate wildly different foods depending on location. From seafood-heavy diets along the Pacific coast to corn-based diets across Mesoamerica. Some have speculated that type O metabolism handles high-protein, high-fat diets differently, an idea that echoes the popular blood type diet, and one most nutrition scientists still consider unproven. And then there's the social dimension, easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore. In small, tightly knit communities, someone whose blood could safely help almost anyone during childbirth or injury wasn't just fortunate, they were valuable. That kind of value doesn't only save lives in the moment. Over generations, it can quietly influence who survives, who thrives, and whose genes carry forward. If the fossil record and early blood tests sketch the outline of this story, modern DNA technology is filling in the details. Over the last 20 years, genetic testing has become precise enough to trace bloodlines back to specific tribes, specific regions, even specific historical figures, something that would have sounded like science fiction not long ago. One striking example involves a direct descendant of Sitting Bull. DNA testing confirmed a genetic link between a living relative and one of the most significant figures in Native American history, closing a gap that family stories alone had never been able to fully settle. For descendants of indigenous peoples, this kind of confirmation carries weight far beyond curiosity. Colonization disrupted records, separated families, and in many cases deliberately cut people off from their tribal histories. DNA testing has become one of the few tools capable of reconnecting some of those severed threads, a path back to ancestors, languages, and communities that history tried to erase. It's not just abstract identity either. For many indigenous people, proving ancestry through DNA can affect access to tribal recognition, resources, and rights tied directly to heritage. In these cases, a genetic test isn't a novelty purchase. It can determine whether someone is formally recognized as part of a community or shut out of it. But this power carries real tension. The same DNA data that reconnects people to their roots can also be bought, sold, and stored by private companies pursuing their own commercial interests. Questions of consent, privacy, and control over this information remain some of the most contested issues in the field. Treating someone's genetic heritage as a product to be packaged and monetized sits uncomfortably against its deeper purpose, helping people understand who they are and where they came from. Scientists in this space increasingly argue that, done responsibly, with indigenous communities involved in how their data is used, this technology can become something rare, a tool that heals historical wounds instead of deepening them. Some DNA results don't just fill out a family tree, they ignite real debate about what scientists thought they understood about an entire continent. That's what happened with a man named Crawford, living on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, one of the largest Native American reservations in the country. When a commercial DNA testing company analyzed his ancestry, the results went well beyond a typical family history report. Though it's worth noting, this wasn't a peer-reviewed academic study. The company's findings pointed to an unusually deep genetic timeline, a claim that remains contested among archaeologists and hasn't been validated by mainstream research. For decades, the dominant theory held that small groups crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, then spread south over generations. If results like Crawford's hold up under scrutiny, they'd complicate that timeline, adding weight to a growing argument among some researchers that the real story may be older, messier, and far less linear than the textbook version suggests. The deeper scientists dig into ancient genomes, the stranger the picture becomes. Take Neanderthals and Denisovans, two ancient human groups long dismissed as primitive evolutionary dead ends. Genetic analysis tells a very different story. Both groups share enough in common with modern humans that some researchers argue they should be considered close relatives rather than separate, inferior species. Archaeological evidence backs this up too, revealing complex tool-making, artistic expression, and even symbolic behavior among Neanderthals, capabilities once thought to belong exclusively to modern humans. And here's the detail that changes everything. Many people alive today carry traces of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Proof these groups didn't simply vanish. They interbred, mixed, and left fingerprints still visible in human genetics tens of thousands of years later. Then there's Lake Baikal in Siberia, the oldest and deepest freshwater lake on Earth, sitting at the center of a migration story most people have never heard. For thousands of years, this single location served as a genetic crossroads where populations from the east and west met, mixed, and exchanged DNA long before any of it was written down. Some researchers believe the ancestors of Native Americans passed directly through this region on their way toward a continent no human had ever set foot on. But perhaps the strangest discovery is proof that indigenous Americans had contact with people from across the open Pacific centuries before European contact. Genetic evidence shows Polynesians and Native Americans interacted roughly 800 years ago, an encounter that left traces still detectable in DNA today. This isn't a minor claim. It means someone crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and met people who had never seen them coming. The clues had been sitting in plain sight for years. Sweet potatoes and bottle gourds, crops native to the Americas, turn up in Polynesian archaeological sites with no other explanation. For a long time, that evidence sparked fierce debate, with many scientists dismissing it as coincidence or contamination. But newer genetic studies changed the conversation. Researchers found shared DNA segments across multiple Polynesian islands, all tracing back to the same indigenous American source. Evidence of real intermarriage, not chance. Using computational methods, scientists even traced that ancestry to a specific region in what is now Colombia. This connects to a larger, still unresolved question: how did people actually first reach the Americas? The land bridge theory remains the dominant explanation, but it's far from the only one on the table. Some researchers argue for a coastal route, hugging the shoreline by boat rather than walking overland. Others raise the possibility of travel across polar ice. And many indigenous nations, including the Navajo, hold their own origin accounts, stories describing peoples who were always present on this land, not arrivals from elsewhere. Science hasn't settled that question, and it may never fully agree on a single answer. What science has settled is this: Type O blood isn't a footnote in any of these stories. It's tied to migrations across oceans, survival through plagues, adaptation to altitude, and connections between continents nobody expected to find linked at all. And it's still doing exactly what it always has. Right now, in hospitals everywhere, Type O blood is being transfused into patients who have no idea their own biology traces back through every twist of this history. So the next time someone calls Type O the plain, universal blood type, you'll know better. It isn't blank, it isn't boring. It's a record written in molecules instead of words, of ice age crossings, plagues survived, mountains adapted to, and oceans somehow crossed by people history nearly forgot to mention. For millions of indigenous people across the Americas, that record isn't abstract. It's running through their veins right now, the same way it ran through the veins of ancestors who endured conditions most of us can barely imagine. Science still doesn't have every answer: exactly how humans first reached this continent, why Type O won out so completely, what really happened on those Pacific shores 8 centuries ago. These questions are still being argued over in labs and journals today. But one thing isn't up for debate. This blood type carried people through history's hardest moments, and it's still quietly doing the same job in hospitals right now, long after most people forgot why it mattered in the first place. If you're Type O, you're not carrying a footnote. You're carrying a survival story centuries in the making.